Welcome to Charts Today Europe. My name's David Linton, and today's edition for Friday, the 26th of October, comes to you from London. And markets all heading south again. The US did close higher last night, but we're seeing the futures suggesting lower, and Asia was down, so that's affecting Europe this morning. The dollar still looking strong, so the strong dollar is the backdrop there. The euro is actually up slightly this morning, but looking bearish against the dollar. So really interesting there that we are seeing that euro lower and heading to 112. So a further nearly 2% downside. And we're actually seeing some new downside targets developing here on the big chart. And of course, on the long-term 1% chart, we have got still these big targets hanging over us. So uh, strong dollar is still the theme dominating the market. Against the yen, the dollar is actually looking a little bit weaker short term. Against sterling, we're seeing sterling nudging 128, so it fell further yesterday. And again, if we take out this August low for sterling, we activate some very big downside targets to parity. So really, that's pricing in that if we get a no-deal Brexit or Brexit falls apart, then the pound will plummet probably based on those targets. Looking at the euro, we're seeing sterling lower here as well, and against the Swiss franc lower too, and against the Aussie dollar up slightly, but still looking bearish. Bitcoin, little change this morning, still looking bearish across the board. And then looking at the markets, the S&P 500 index actually bounced yesterday, um, but we have entered this territory where we have a lower low. That's what gives us the downside target. The relief rally and then the move to the lower low, classic Dow theory giving us that downside target. The same with the Nasdaq. We're seeing here the Nasdaq was up quite sharply yesterday, but we have actually made the lower low now, so that's given us the downside targets on the 1% chart. And we've got downside potential here still of some 8%, 14% on that big target. And then on the Dow, we've got 11% downside targets. We're seeing targets of around 10% downside across the board on a lot of these charts. The Dow actually just entering bearish territory there, was up 1.6% yesterday. The broader based Russell 2000 index recovered a little bit, but it was making the lower low first. Classic market breadth signal where the smaller stocks were making new lows before the bigger stocks, and ultimately dragging the market down. 17% downside there, so small stocks really being hit. Looking at the futures, we're seeing the S&P future down 0.5%, the Nasdaq future down just under 1%. So we are seeing markets falling there. Looking at Europe now open, the FTSE down just under 1%. Mid caps actually faring a little bit better, down just 0.8%. And the DAX actually recovering a little bit at the open. So we are seeing the DAX now just flat. The CAC Quarant opened lower, down 1%, so interesting there as well. And the Japanese market was down nearly a third percent. Hang Seng was down 0.75%. China still looks terrible on the charts, but not as badly down as the other markets. Commodities still down on this sentiment. Uh, Brent crude down 1% this morning, still bearish short term, as is WTI. Gold actually up at 12.34 dollars, and we are seeing here as markets roll over and enter bear trends, gold is actually rolling up and entering a bull trend. Looking at treasury yields, we see here the US 10-year yield is actually lower at 3.1%. Really, the market's now starting to price in the fact that the Fed may not raise rates with this market turmoil. Here we see just the world indices. This data on this tab all coming from either Thomson Reuters Icon, or if you're a private user, Metastock, same systems. And here looking at the data on this tab, all coming from Yahoo Finance. So again, coming into Updata, really useful. And so we see here world indices coming from Yahoo, and we've got Europe down and Asia also pretty bearish across the board. The Nikkei down 0.4%, for example. So we are just seeing most markets heading lower. Taking a look at those tech stocks in the US first, the Nasdaq 100, we saw quite big performances there. Google up 4%. They disappointed with their results in after-hours trading, and the shares were down 7 or 8%. So it'll be interesting to see how they open today. Much the same was true of Amazon, up strongly yesterday, but that gain unwound with results just slightly below expectation. There's a lot of expectation with Amazon. 2.9 billion in profit was not enough to push the market higher. The market was pushing for more. So we will see interesting moves in Amazon and Alphabet today. Apple was up 2%, still holding on. So the biggest stock in the market still looking pretty strong. Facebook recovered a few percent, but still this chart looks pretty bearish and big downside targets there. Not much change there. Microsoft was up 5.8%, still holding its bull trend, interestingly. Netflix was up 3%. Nvidia, which has really sold off this week, recovered a little bit, but now looks terrible on the chart. And last of all, Tesla. We saw big moves here, and it's been a big week for Tesla. In fact, with this weekly candle, we see a big recovery here, so that's been pretty key. Looking across to FTSE this morning, a sea of red. If we look at the performances, we see only a handful of performances. IAG and British Airways up quite sharply this morning on results. So the market's price taken kindly to that. Whitbread is the next best performer, but only up 0.4%. EasyJet up in sympathy with BA, but really only a handful of stocks that are up. If we look to the downside, Royal Bank Scotland down nearly 5%, making higher provisions for PPI, and that's taking the stock long-term bearish. So really, we're seeing still potential of 19% downside in RBS. Ocado's been quite badly hit this last few weeks, and we're seeing that as well. And we're looking at some of the other stocks. We're really seeing some quite big falls here, 2% down. And again, these prices are all coming in from Yahoo this morning. So we're seeing a pretty bloody screen there for FTSE. The 250 mid caps is actually probably faring a little bit better, and we have got some quite good performances here this morning. BCA up 4%, for example, but the chart's not looking great. It's very hard to find stocks that are trending up and moving to new highs. So nearly all these stocks are falling below their trends, and we're seeing really it's very difficult to find anything that's actually rising. Looking at the downside, and again, there's a lot of it. Bailey Gifford down 3.4. That's the Japanese trust. Looking at Elementric also falling lower there, and looking at Synthema, lots of stocks just falling lower. Looking over to Europe, we see here, if we just look for the best performers, we've got Nestle up 10%, Ultran Technologies up 19%. This is interesting. Nestle is one stock that is still trending. We're talking about finding stocks that are trending. They're there, but you have to work now quite hard to find them in this market. Norske Hydro up 1.5%, but again bearish on that chart. Kindred Group also pushing lower. Looking at the worst performers, and unfortunately there's a lot of them, we're seeing SEB down 14-15%, really plummeting there. This shows what happens with trends that are stocks that are already in downtrends, and these targets were already given, so targets been given and met. Electrolux also heavily down this morning, down 12%. So really, it's a pretty bloody screen still, and stocks having a terrible week. In fact, a terrible month. So hopefully next week we'll get a little bit of respite. That's it for today. Until Monday, have a great weekend. Happy charting. See you then.